he called for taking all of Novorossiya under Russian control, which would then include everything up to Odessa.
He's winning. Now, if people don't believe he's winning, then he needs to demonstrate pretty conclusively that he is.
Welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran, an author, and a former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So thank you for coming back on. It's great to see you. I want to talk to you about this recent interview by President Putin. That is, he outlined what appears to be now expanded objectives, we can call it. That is, he called for taking all of Novorossiya under Russian control, which would then include everything up to Odessa. He talked about these buffer zones being lost in Kharkov, Sumy, essentially as punishment for Kursk, as well as having obvious strategic objectives. And this is happening also as many of the front lines are cracking. I was wondering, do you see this as a new stage of the war, or how are you assessing this I guess new rhetoric coming from the Russian president?
Well, first of all, I think that President Putin has said more than once since the beginning of this war that Kharkov and Odessa are historically Russian-speaking cities. So I hesitate to say that it was always the objective, but I think most Russians believed from the beginning that if they were going to do this, those two cities would have to end up in Russian hands. Secondly, I think he's looking at the reality that the security zone for Russia's interests and safety has to be much larger than originally planned or anticipated. Let's face it, Ukraine has become a much more dangerous irritant over time than I think he expected it to. Ukraine itself as a nation, I would describe it as close to dead. But we have this facade of a government in Ukraine with an infrastructure of supporters, not much from the population, but hardcore supporters, thousands of mercenaries and foreigners, and they are able to launch periodically missiles and drones to create the illusion that there is some real power or influence there in the hopes of attracting more money. And I think you know that Zelensky wants $90 billion from Donald Trump, and Trump actually sat with him and talked to him, to my surprise. And to my horror, I'm told he's considering it. I hope not, but anything is possible these days. So I think that's a signal that there are plans afoot now, military plans, to make those things a reality. I don't think the Sumy exercise is necessarily a punishment. I think it's just a realistic appraisal that says, if we don't control this territory, we have no security in Russia. Russia cannot be secure. But I think Odessa is going to come under attack, and it's going to be seized. Now, can he do more than that? Yes, he probably can. Will he? I don't know. I have listened to voices in Russia say this will not end until we are in Kiev and we absolutely eliminate this regime. I think a lot of people have reached that conclusion. And they don't understand why we have not done more. The thing that's most tragic about the entire picture, Glenn, is that in Russia, at any rate, people genuinely like Americans. And they think that Americans and they are alike. Now, that's not really true. We would make good strategic partners for different reasons, but we are as different from the Russians as the Chinese are. That doesn't mean we can't get along, but I think they have developed this view that we have a lot more in common than we do, and at the same time, they have this very positive picture of Trump. They think Trump is really a good person, that he really wants the best. They don't understand what they're dealing with. The reality TV star who migrates in the direction of whatever promises to make him look good. That's not what they're accustomed to. All you have to do to contrast Trump with President Putin, look at Putin on the stage, the way he behaves, the way he holds himself, how he dresses, how he speaks. The audience, look at the people that are in the audience. How do they dress? How do they look? How do they comport themselves? Then look at what we've got in the United States for a president. It's totally different, completely unrelated. Putin is as close to a czar as you're going to get in the modern world. And he does have one foot in the czarist world. He's got another foot in the Soviet world. He knows both. And he has moved Russia down, I think, a very good path to unity and prosperity because he understands that those are critical. With unity and prosperity, you also get security. No one in the United States thinks like that. Trump doesn't even consider those things. But for better or worse, they think we're friends. And they think Trump is a good guy.
Well, Trump, he did, well, it seemed like he was going for a diplomatic path. It seemed that he thought it was better for the US to get along with Russia and essentially, well, bring them over to our side of the ledger. But since those days, he now appears to have embraced his inner Biden. That is, he's made this his war as well. I mean, part of this is also linked up, I think, with this new narrative, which is just coming out of every media outlet across the West now, which is that Ukraine is winning again. What do you think? What do you think the calculations by Trump is? I mean, you mentioned he might start sending billions in aid again to Ukraine. So, what is the strategy here? Will the U.S. go back into, well, deeper into the war against Russia?
First and foremost, you must understand that there is no strategy. There never has been. We had something resembling a strategy as a result of George Kennan, his Mr. X article, and what then subsequently became a containment. Since then, our strategy has been to retain control of the 750 bases in 80 countries, to continue to exert influence in our pursuit of financial hegemony. And see, what underpins financial hegemony in the American mind has been military hegemony. So the American thinks, well, if I spend $1 trillion on defense, I get all these benefits, including financial hegemony around the world. It's all nonsense, but that's the way people think. Americans think of defense as you go to the supermarket, you buy something off the shelf, a loaf of bread, butter, or a roast beef, whatever it is. And that's defense. Well, we buy this, we've got defense. No understanding of how you build military power or anything else. So this is what confronts President Putin. This is what confronts the Iranians, the same thing. There is no strategy. And whatever President Trump wakes up in the morning and decides to do is what we do. And he is not planning the systematic demise or destruction of Russia. Absolutely not. Wouldn't know how to begin. So what's he trying to do? Well, he's trying to do whatever he thinks is going to benefit him and his presidency. And a little down the line, well, it may be helpful to America. How he defines that is beyond me. I have no idea. I see no benefit to us from involvement in Ukraine in any way. I see no benefit to us strategically from attacking Iran. So, somebody says, well, what are those benefits? I haven't got an answer because it sounds stupid to me. But the problem is that's where we are. That's all that you've got at this point. So I understand that there was supposedly a recent meeting involving President Trump and his inner circle and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and maybe some other military leaders to talk about what do we do if we resume bombing with the goal of, quote unquote, finishing the job. That's about as crazy as here's $90 billion, now go win your war in Ukraine. It's absurd. We know that everything that goes to Ukraine, about 50% of it, just disappears into corruption, the black hole of corruption. What happens to the rest of it? Well, a lot of it is sold off. I mean, the Ukrainians have been furnishing Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico cartels with all sorts of interesting equipment and capabilities that were given to them by Europeans and by us. You would think President Trump is aware of that. I don't know if anybody ever tells him that. I don't know if he were told that he'd believe it. Who knows? But there is no strategic framework. There is no end state. It's all about how do we stay on top? In other words, how do we remain the world's financial hegemon and military hegemon? Well, we've just discovered that we are not the world's military hegemon. We've been defeated unambiguously. Instead of recognizing that and saying, oh, it's time to step back and reconsider what we're doing, he's talking about doubling down again. It's worse than insane. So when you see all these globalists that come out of the woodwork, I listened to Neil Ferguson the other day. Oh, Ukraine is now in a position where it could strike back and win. I don't know of anyone who is sane, who has visited Ukraine, who thinks Ukraine has a snowball's chance in hell of winning a war against Russia. What is much more likely now is that the Russians are that Putin finally says, that's enough, no more. And remember, he's in a tough position. When I speak about Russia, I've always had people say, well, Macgregor, sure, you say this, the Russians can do this. You say the Russians are doing that. Well, if they can do all those things, why haven't they already won? Why haven't they crossed the river? Why haven't they entered Kiev? Why haven't they just marched west? In other words, nobody believes you until it's done. The burden of proof is on Russia right now to prove that it can do what it can.
When you look at the economic situation, how long do you think this can go on? Because the main leaders in Europe now, they're quite unpopular, but the economies are also quite shaky, yet they want to send more and more weapons, more and more money to Kiev. But now even the Germans have begun to express some concern about the budgets. That is, well, things are not looking well. If the economy tanks, a lot of things can go wrong. Did you see the possibility? Like, how do you see the possibility of continuing to drag on with this war? Because the Europeans are still making the point that it's too early, too premature to talk about any diplomacy with the Russians. I mean, this is 4.5 years of boycotting diplomacy. So,
Well, I know that in the next 12 months, we have roughly $18 trillion in treasuries that have to be rolled over. That's an average coupon of 3.3%. The 1-year treasury now in the United States is roughly 4%. So you roll that at $8 trillion today at the current level, you're looking at $49 billion in annual interest costs. And that's before you factor in the interest burden on the ongoing $2 trillion annual deficit. Glenn, I know we're broke. Let's be frank about it. We're absolutely broke. When it comes to the oil situation, you get different interpretations. But I'm told that within the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're looking at very, very perilously low levels in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The military privately thinks that we need at least 240 million gallons in order to be prepared to do much of anything. Barrels, 240 million barrels. I don't know where we are now, but I know we're getting close. I imagine the situation in Europe is as bad, if not worse. The gilts in London, which is the English word for treasury, they're in a lot of trouble. I don't think the economy there is going to hold up much longer. In France, I think everything depends upon the same thing as it does in Germany. If you're in Germany or France, you're waiting for your check to arrive from the government. Where's my pension check? And so that I can go on vacation or I can do X, Y, and Z. When that stops, when that's disrupted, when that's interrupted, then all hell will break loose. That's much more important to people in Europe, as you know, than what happens in Russia.
but that kind of took me also, to my last question, which is, how do you see this war? How does it end? And how does Europe look like after this war? That is, I can't see a possible end to the war, because even if everything east of the Dnieper River falls to Russia, why would the Europeans or the US as well want to give up a proxy where they can just, as long as you call it resistance in Ukraine, can launch drones, missiles into Russia and continue to try to weaken it. So how does this war actually come to an end?
Well, Glenn, you know that we Americans have this unfortunate habit, utilizing the Central Intelligence Agency to influence elections. And we have influenced recent elections in Europe. I think the leadership in Romania, in Moldova, would certainly be different from what you see right now had we not meddled in those countries. I think there are several leaders at the top of NATO who are compromised, who are effectively agents for U.S. interests. They are tools of Central Intelligence. This is not new. This is not a revelation, although some people will be surprised to hear this. The point is that has to end. And how do you get rid of these people? Well, you have to wake up the populations, get them to recognize the criticality of their interests. You're beginning to see that in Germany for the first time, since the 1970s, when we went through this debate about the theater or intermediate range nuclear force, the INF. You'll remember that before we got to the treaty. And Helmut Schmidt came in, he took over the government and steered Germany in support of it, which at the time was the right thing to do. It was necessary. But there were people then saying, it's time for us to become neutral. Well, it wasn't. A good time for that would have been right after the Second World War or certainly in the early 50s, but that opportunity was missed. Maybe in the future. I think I see the Germans now moving back in that direction, recognizing that they do have core national interests, and those have to be respected. So when you say, how does this end? I think it ends when we pack up our things and go home. Number one, we leave. We butt out. Somebody said to me, when's this war with Iran end? If the MOU is not worth the paper it's written on, how does it end? It ends when we sail away, we fly away. Because remember, we don't live there. This is what Europeans need to remember. We don't live there. Charles de Gaulle kept trying to tell them that Americans do not live in Europe. Okay, he's right. So we pack up our things and we say, that's enough. We can't afford to stay. We're leaving. By the way, that's something that privately President Trump wanted to do back 4, 5, 6 years ago when he was in office. Didn't know how to do it, but he wanted to disengage. Not commercially. We continue to do business. We want to be partners, but we want to get out of this business of garrisoning other people's countries, right? Dismantle it. It's an anachronism. It's being demonstrated that it is an anachronism in the Persian Gulf. All the forces that we put on the ground in Europe today that should be there to protect Europeans from an imminent Russian invasion, that's the theory, they would all be eliminated in the opening minutes of any war by precision-guided missiles and unmanned systems. Hello, that's the way it is. Warfare has changed. Doesn't work anymore. It needs to get out. Doesn't mean that Europe is defenseless, because what Iran has done, every European country can do. And the European alliances that want to exist, that will work with each other, that are culturally comfortable with each other. And I think that's very important in Europe, where they share certain interests. They can build the kind of capability that Iran has built that defeated us. So this can all be done. But as long as we're there, as long as we have our fingers in this, and as long as we're putting up money, it's going to be very difficult to get around that. So I always say we've got to go. And I don't say that meaning I want my country to fail. No, that's just nothing to do with it. We've got to get out. And when we do, it will end. And I think that's what President Putin understands. And that's why I think you're going to see some military action coming in the near future. I think you will. I don't know how decisive it will be. I hope it's enough to persuade the Europeans it's time to sit down and put an end to this and have some serious talks. It's funny. I remember you in particular years ago when we started talking about this stuff, who said, the longer you wait for talks, the longer you wait to negotiate, the worse outcome you're going to get. I mean, people didn't seem to listen, and we act as though we won against Iran. We keep talking about Iran has to meet these requirements. Really? They won. We didn't. That's what Vice President Vance is telling everybody. Now, what are you going to do? Tell Putin that he has to fulfill these obligations or we're not going to talk to him? He's winning. Now, if people don't believe he's winning, then he needs to demonstrate pretty conclusively that he is. I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, no, it could be in the very near future as well. Anyways, we already ran out of time, so thank you as always for sharing your insights, Colonel. Much appreciated.
All right, Glenn. Thank you. Nice to see you.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。